Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Very warm welcome to the session on Beyond the Hallowed Hallways, University Social Responsibility for Socio-economic and Environmental Reforms. It's a pertinent and topical issue that universities face today. And we have a very distinguished panel with us today to talk about these various aspects of what's called the university social responsibility. Our first speaker is Professor Soobaroyen, who's a professor of accounting at Essex Business School, Deputy Director, Center for Accountability and Global Development, and currently Deputy Dean, Partnerships at the University of Essex. His research and impact work addresses the role of accounting, accountability, and governance in diverse settings, with a focus on the Global South, related to social, environmental, and governance disclosure practices within a range of organizations and the implementation of corporate governance codes. His work has been published widely. Recent research and commission reports have been funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, the African Professionalization Initiative, the World Bank's Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability, and the UK Financial Reporting Council, as well as the European Union delegation. We also have with us Professor Naresh Singh, who's Professor and Vice Dean at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. He's the Director of the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy. He has a transdisciplinary PhD in environmental sciences with more than 3 decades of public policy experience in senior positions in the United Nations and the federal government of Canada. He has a wide range of research interest in areas in which he teaches and public policy design and evaluation. His work focuses upon decision-making in complex situations, including conflict and peace building, sustainable livelihoods, transformations for catalyzing SDG achievement, international development cooperation, and a range of other areas. Professor Singh has taught at several universities, including Boston, Harvard, Fordham, McGill, Waterloo, and Guelph. And he's currently also a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Davis, who's the Professor of Law and International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University and a Global Fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He's also a senior research scholar at both the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University and the US Asia Law Institute at NYU. He was the 2018-2019 Residential Fellow at the Wilson Center and 2016-2017 at Reagan Fussell Democracy Fellow at the US National Endowment for Democracy. He was Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong for many years, till late 2016. Professor Wilma Vialle is a professor of educational psychology and pro-vice chancellor at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Prior to taking on this role, Professor Vialle was the associate dean for international for the Faculty of Social Sciences and the chair of the university's academic senate. She has published extensively in the field of giftedness and talent development, including a text on educating the gifted learner, co-authored with Professor Karen Rogers. We welcome all speakers to this session, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion. I think each one of our speakers bring very distinct experiences in commenting on this idea of university social responsibility. We will begin with Professor Soobaroyen. Over to you, Professor Soobaroyen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be involved with this conference and talk. And I visited the university in January, so it's sort of, I can at least recognize not just the virtual, but the physical element of the institution. So I'll probably sort of highlight three key things, or three perhaps level at which I am kind of responding to these particular questions regarding the sustainability, responsibility, and socio-economic responsibility of universities, based a bit on my research and other areas that I've looked at. Firstly, I think obviously universities, organizations are multifaceted, multidimensional organizations, maybe quite traditionally seen very much in terms of their specific sort of education and research kind of responsibilities. But I think gradually over time, certainly from a UK perspective, we have seen a very significant change in terms of their accountability, I think is probably the right word, accountability to not only government or other type of formal agencies, but also to the wider community. I think that's to do perhaps with also in the UK from a sort of perspective of being publicly funded, having to provide more and more information, perhaps, and more understanding of how maybe it's delivering on its educational outcomes, how it's delivering on its research outcomes, but then increasingly how it's delivering on its social and community level outcomes, I would say, whether the community or the is sort of a local UK or whether it's much broader than that. So I think one of the things that I have researched and quite a lot of research is looking at the way that they become more accountable, providing more accountability and disclosure and transparency. An aspect which started perhaps earlier in the US before it kind of went into the UK and other countries. And one thing which could be perhaps a little bit more, in terms of a finding, is that there's a mixed sort of evidence around transparency and accountability. Universities may be quite transparent in terms of certain aspects of their activities, certain aspects of their role within society, but fairly less transparent when it comes to other aspects. So things such as, if you look at their disclosures, you look at the way that they're reporting, you will find quite variations in the way that the information will provide. Beyond simply, obviously, the sort of student-based information or course-based information, whether they are involved in local community, whether they are taking action with the environment, and so on and so forth, that has been a little bit more mixed. There's more recent sort of initiatives taken at that level. Perhaps we talk about the time education rankings regarding SDGs, for example, Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a lot more now information around, what are their contribution or how are they communicating their contribution on on things such as responsible consumption, peace, justice, and strong institutions, or reducing inequalities. How do they actually contribute that? Perhaps in the past, perhaps is in a sense of it was deemed to be implicitly happening, implicitly being delivered, but no one wanted to challenge. These are what I call in the literature taken for granted institutions. Universities were taken for granted institutions in terms of how they were legitimately operating within society. But now, of course, we have a vast range of institutions and universities, and therefore more questions about that. So that's one level, perhaps, I think that's quite important to understand. A second level is governance and governance of universities. Again, some of my own research started looking at the way how decisions made, how our university councils and other sort of apex systems within universities make decisions under the broader umbrella, if you want, of government influence or private influence. And again, here, it has taken some time perhaps to gather information about how universities are governed, who are part of a council, for example, how are decisions made. And again, it's an element of, as you read it, you'll find, again, quite a mixed evidence on certain institutions being fairly well-governed, well-structured, and others being there's less information about that. So I think this is the sort of second level. Perhaps I'm looking at the idea of their socio-economic. It's the way they are governed, the way they are owned, and the way that they are executive management, like any other organization, is held to account within that. And there's been many cases in the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere, of particular challenges, and let's put it that way, challenges to the way universities are managed and controlled. And the third element that I want and pass on to other colleagues to discuss about, I think the third element is, and which is very present in the UK after now nearly about 20 years, is the idea of impact. In other words, how does your research, how does its main activity about research in particular provide social and economic impact? We know there's academic impact. We can measure academic impact. We can measure the way that research is being cited or used by organizations around the world. But what is less easy to estimate is what is the impact of that research at a social and economic level. So as you may know, in the UK, we've got the Research Excellence Framework that tries to measure, that tries to evaluate whether the research of universities has a social and economic impact. And here there's been a lot more, I think, positive development as institutions have recognized more and more that it's not just the research that gets published or gets presented in a paper, but also how it's being demonstrated that this research is actually reaching society, community, government, policymakers, and how this has an impact. I mean, it's easy for certain type of studies and certain types of research. It's far less easy, let's say, for social sciences, where the pathway to having an impact is less obvious. But I will. So these are the three levels in the way I look at the way of the socio-economic development. Some of it may be a little bit more optimistic. Some of it may be a little bit challenging as you look across the world. But I'll pass on now to my colleagues to continue on this, or obviously bring other things to the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soobaroyen, for giving a broad framework, an overall framework within which we can assess universities' impact on the community at various levels. Our next speaker is Professor Singh. Professor Naresh Singh, over to you.
Thanks, Professor Bonnerjee. And let me pick up from, make a few quick points from where Professor Soobaroyen left off to build on what he said, and with which I agree. I think the way, for example, this seminar is defined this morning, it talks broadly about universities' responsibility in the areas of social and environmental dimension. So that's a bit broad, and one might even say vague. And I would define or attempt to define the role in terms of the rather well-established ESG frameworks. So the environmental social governance frameworks are now really well established with good standards of measurement and so on. So the first one I'd make is that universities might want to, on a voluntary basis, adopt a set of standards for themselves that they would like to deliver against over a period of time, year 1, year 2, year 3, and then they can either self-monitor or have some national body monitor the progress that they are making towards their own stated goals in terms of their responsibility to ESG. And of course, the environmental dimensions are well known. The social dimensions include, the well-being of employees, even the health and well-being and the education of communities around them, and so on. The governance issues, and Professor Soobaroyen referred to those, the governance issues, of course, include even human rights and the way universities behave within their institution, but beyond that as well. So that's the first thing. So the word responsibility is the one that I'm trying to define a bit more objectively. So we need, I believe, to have both a philosophical statement, a mission statement in terms of the ESG dimensions of a given university, but then come on to state in standards terms what we will achieve over time. So point number one. Point number two is, just to make it really clear, and again, building off on the previous speaker, I think we need to think much more in terms of capitals rather than just flows. And by capitals thinking, I am referring to, natural capital, social capital, human capital, and so on. So most countries and institutions measure progress in terms of a given set of flows, whether that be educational outcomes, if it's a corporation, financial bottom lines, and so on and so on. But what are we doing to the national stock of capital of a given country, or indeed the global stock of natural, social, human, and produced capital? That move towards capital measurement and accounting has been with us for a very long time, but it's only recently that the Global Capitals Coalition, for example, out of The Hague, out of the Netherlands, and now several countries, including Canada, where I live, we have just set up a committee to help government and corporations report on their impact on the capitals. So I think that will also be something that we can talk about, and universities should be thinking about teaching, measuring, and so on, more a capitals approach. The third big point that I'd make is two ways of going forward. How do we integrate ESG concerns into our teaching, research, and our campus and community contributions? In all three areas, we should make it explicit. And I would go as far as to suggest that this be incorporated in the performance development reviews of faculty. See, if we don't get to that level, that granular level, I don't think we will really change and improve our contributions and our behavior. Then we need to think, of course, at our contributions, not only at the local level, at our own university, for example. I think much room exists for a greater interaction with our local level, our local people. I mean, the people of Sonipat probably look at this university as an oasis of strange things, one might say, because of the not enough interaction and porosity between the community and ourselves. And we should ask ourselves, how is the community benefiting from our presence, except in job creation, which it clearly does. But then we have a contribution at national and global levels, and especially a school like ours, our School of Government and Public Policy, needs to be really engaging with national and state level policymakers to bring these ideas and to go beyond that, to really work with them in integrating it more and more effectively into the India level. And then through India, see, for example, we get great opportunities, like when India is the chair of the G20. How do universities interact with the G20 through the Indian presidency is a great opportunity. Final point I'd make is that we sometimes forget is constraints. What prevents us from doing all the great things that we will all talk about on this panel and all the things I have just mentioned? Now, if you look at the way our faculty workload is defined, with publications, and to get particular publications, you focus on a really narrow given area, and then on your research area, and you get your 2 publications, your 2 Scopus Index publications. If you are going to also deliver your 2 courses per semester, do you really have any time to do anything else? Point 1. Point 2, If it is not reflected in your PDR in a significant way, and if our HR department doesn't take that on board, and not only us, HR department of any university, if it doesn't take it seriously on board, we could talk till the cows come home and no change is going to happen. And finally, institutional priorities. It has to come from the very top, and it has to then infiltrate down the ladder that this university is dedicated to ESG contributions. So those will be my opening comments. Jayani, back to you.
Thank you, Professor Singh. I think your comments connected very well to Professor Soobaroyen's idea of an overall governance and how it needs to filter through. I think your suggestion of integrating ESG concerns at a very granular level is quite useful, and we hope to return to that and discuss, the different ways in which we can integrate ESG frameworks and university social responsibility into our teaching and into everyday lives of the university a bit later on. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Davis. Over to you, Professor Davis.
So I guess I really appreciate the first two speakers are sort of looking at this problem from the inside looking out. And I guess as a human rights lawyer, scholar, activist, I've more often encountered this problem on the receiving end, sort of the client communities that I've worked with. So I'll mention a few things that have been my observation. I'm not an expert on university administration, but I am on human rights and development. So I kind of look at it from the other side. Up front, I want to emphasize, however, that university social responsibility should not be seen as in competition with the education mission. I think we have to understand our students take inspiration from what we do as professors and what our institutions do. So that inspiration is what drives their education. So we should understand that when we do things that produce that inspiration, that's very much in service of the education mission, and perhaps we have to find a way to reward that in the process. This raises for me a number of questions. One is, what subjects should we teach? Obviously, the topic of this panel is we should teach subjects related to university social responsibility out in the community, like human rights, things on the environment, climate change, and so on, and controversial subjects. And I think we have to also understand that a lot of students have problems themselves of freedom to openly discuss these topics in class. I teach very controversial topics, and I have to constantly sort of try to bring students out. But I've also encountered cases where students, because I've taught a lot of Chinese overseas students in Hong Kong and also in the US, and they are afraid to speak out. So how can we be aware of this consciousness that they have, because they're often monitored? Not all academic work is taking place in nice places where academic freedom is guaranteed. And so I think on that score also, we have to appreciate how we react to the lack of academic freedom in the global community. One of the things I notice is that some places where universities have really no academic freedom, in fact, in China, for example, there's a directive called Document Number 9, which tells professors in China that they're not to teach constitutionalism, free speech, separation of powers, and so on. So those universities still that are operating under these guidelines are given high rankings in the global ranking system. So I think when we're looking at universities, and when we're, all of us get these emails asking us to offer our opinions in the ranking process, we should be conscious of the fact whether there's academic freedom in the institutions that we're ranking. So this is something I think we should pay attention to. So both academic freedom for our students inbound and academic freedom in how we react and interact with other universities. Do we encourage it? So that's, again, an area of social responsibility. We can ask whether incentives for tenure and promotion consider community work. Now, as a lawyer who's presented evidence in administrative cases and court hearings involving Indigenous people and environmental cases, it's very important that university professors step up and be those witnesses and speak out in those hearings and commissions. Do the institutions encourage that? Do they reward it? Do they publicize it? Again, to create that inspiration for students to come and to learn, it's important that these things are done and are seen to be done. And another thing, does the university credit and publicize service in community boards or testimony before legislative bodies? When I testify before, I spent my whole career in Hong Kong. I can't safely go back there. So when I testify and things, I get I'm become the villain in some ways for condemning, the crackdown of a regime. But at the same time, our institutions should appreciate that willingness to stand up. So it's not always just a kind of budget decision. It's a support for the work that faculty and even students do in drawing attention to some kinds of injustices. So I think town and gown relationships are more than just public relations. It's kind of putting it out there as to what the faculty is doing and demonstrating that commitment that provides the inspiration for what we do. So does the university also, how does it treat publications? Personally, this is an area dear to my heart. I know university, this one I'm in talks about COPUS, but COPUS isn't always where you have the most impact. Publishing in those journals. I'd rather publish in Foreign Affairs or the Journal of Democracy. I doubt that they're on COPUS, but I think that's where people actually read what you're publishing. It's widely spread among policymakers, academics, and the public at large. So when there's really good scholarship, I think we need to be a little more flexible about where we put it and how we evaluate it. I think the same comes up with books. When I'm finishing a book right now. It's on a controversial public issue. It's about the crackdown in Hong Kong. I don't want to wait 2 years to get it out the other end in publication. I need to find a venue to publish it where it gets out. So again, I think we straitjacket ourselves when it comes to how we interact with the problems that our own colleagues are trying to address in the community and how we reward that kind of work. Let's see, a couple other points. Okay, I think this last point that I want to make, it relates to how we react to people, professors and others who suffer problems in their home institutions. I know recently I taught in University of Hong Kong, and last time was 2020. I can't go back now, but a lot of my colleagues have been pressed out as well. They first get attacked in some kind of Communist Party media, and then they know they have to flee because the police take signals from this publicity attacking them for really just exercising academic freedom. So what do we do when we're not in that environment? Do we welcome these professors? I mean, there are arrangements to address problems of academics at risk, but I think that's something that doesn't get enough attention. Since I've been out of Hong Kong, I have helped colleagues to find positions, but it's very difficult. And so I think a kind of incestuousness that goes on in the leading academic communities, where they only hire sort of from within those communities, sometimes in terms of the degrees and everything people get, sometimes has to be opened up a little bit, because these kinds of professors who have been on the front lines of global conflicts over social issues, environmental issues, human rights, are sometimes going to bring something really important to the table that our students, again, can take inspiration from. So that kind of support for that, I think, is very important. And then I would put in a plug for Indigenous and marginalized communities. I know wherever I've taught, and I've taught in India, I've taught in East Asia, I've taught in the United States, these communities are often just not sufficiently present. And it's not just white Americans not bringing in minorities. It's sometimes other kinds of communities like India and elsewhere where the same thing happens, where people are left out. And so how can universities do that? I think it's a project not just of the work we do and drawing attention to it, but of the admissions office. And so I think that's another way. This is how I see things from where the kind of work that I do. And I'll stop there and wait for our further discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis, and especially for highlighting the fact that as academics, many of us are also activists, and the importance of connections. I think what you said really brought out very well the connections between the local level, the national level, and the global or the international level. The kind of solidarities that we may want to form. Universities need to facilitate those connections for university social responsibility to be more meaningful. Your point on the need to focus on marginalized communities is also quite important, I feel. And I hope we can return to this during our discussion later on. So thank you, Professor Davis. And our next speaker is Professor Wilma Vialle. Over to you, Professor Vialle.
Thank you, Jayani. And I think what I'm going to do is probably pick up on some points made by all three of our previous speakers within the context of a very specific example of the university at which I've been teaching and researching for the last 30 years. So I'd like to start by saying that at the moment I'm sitting on Dharawal country, and Dharawal country represents the local Indigenous peoples who were the traditional custodians of our land. I acknowledge their contributions to the knowledge that we have, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And in a sense, that is one example, picking up on what Michael just was talking about, First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples, that it is now embedded in the DNA of the University of Wollongong. And Wollongong is a very difficult name to pronounce for a lot of people. But again, the word Wollongong is the name of the city in which we're located. Our first campus is located. It's just south of Sydney, and we're on the water. And the word Wollongong is actually an Aboriginal word that comes from a local language that means where the mountain meets the sea. So we sit on the Pacific Ocean with Mount Kira and Mount Kembla, both very important parts of the local Aboriginal culture and their knowledge system. University of Wollongong itself is quite a unique university in the sense that it grew from its community. So not quite 50 years ago, the local community, which was a working class town built on coal mining, other forms of mining and steel production, decided that it needed a university that would train its engineers and the kind of workforce that it needed to be able to progress. And from those modest beginnings 50 odd years ago, the idea of community, local, and we have several locals. So we have campuses that range from Bega, which is 5 hours drive south of here, up to our highlands and up to Sydney. I guess part of the message that came from that growth was that the power of education to transform lives. And that has remained an essential part of the DNA of this university. So it's still reflected in all sorts of actions, like our acknowledgement of country, our reconciliation action plan that is constantly revisited, our big efforts to support first in family students to attend university and to succeed in their chosen courses, our emphasis on facilitating for socio-economic disadvantaged students. All of these are just part of our community focus and our deep interactions. It's interesting because when the university was first established, the bulk of the workforce was associated with the mining and steel industry. And, you know, sort of you had this minority at the university, you had this kind of town and gown thing with, you know, sort of going on there. What's happened over the years is that we see that this has shifted, but we are still very much a part of the community and seek to engage in all the ways we can. About 30 years ago, we went global. So we established our first offshore campus in Dubai, and we've been there for nearly 30 years. 30 years we celebrate this year. More recently, we've acquired campuses in Hong Kong and in Malaysia, both in Penang and Kuala Lumpur. Internationalisation for us then is not just about, as it is for many Australian universities, about how many international students you can get through your doors, but it is about being more mindful, idealistic, and transformative in order to reverse the adverse effects of economic globalisation. And educating our next generation of global citizens. I am actually quoting from Liu in 2021. So global citizenship is at the heart of what we try to do for our students, and that's what we promise a UOW education will deliver, that global mindset, which is about understanding the responsibilities. And I think each of our three speakers have kind of emphasised how you have to get that in every single part of what you do as a university. So it is in our strategic plan 2020 to 2025, kind of hold it up here. The idea of a civic university is one of the three pillars. So we have education, we have research, we have the civic university that builds on that. And so then it flows from that to each of our enabling plans. 3 of our 12 key performance indicators are around this area of social inclusion, social responsibility, and global sustainability. So those are, you know, sort of 1/4 are dedicated to those areas. As you would expect, the United Nations Strategic Development Goals are a very important part, and we have champions within each of our faculties that drive those. We think about how we embed them in curriculum, how they come from research, and so on. So in terms of the global citizenship idea that we're trying to communicate to all of our students, we talk about that in relation to transformative research. So looking at our research strengths and partnerships to contribute particularly to post-COVID recovery, especially in developing economies. We talk about transformative education, ensuring through our curriculum development and design that all of our students have equitable access to high quality international learning opportunities. Empowering experiences where we deliver a high quality student experience, whether online or on campus, that is characterised by care, community and well-being. The idea of global connectedness, where we build on the strengths of our network of global campuses and partnerships to transform and strengthen the impact of our research and teaching in those global communities. And last but definitely not least is the idea of ethical internationalization. So enhancing our internationalization approach through that alignment to the UN SDGs. I just want to pick up on one more point. Michael, you talked about promotions, how we have to kind of, that's another way in which universities can say we're serious about this, and we can model that, we reward that kind of thing. We put a heavy emphasis in terms of research performance for promotion, not so there's a certain amount for the metrics that are traditional, but impact is equally, and in some discipline areas, more important than the metrics. And so that impact is measured around these kinds of ideas, but also the notion of the service that that we provide to communities, to organisations and so on. So it's very much an important part of the narrative that's used for promotion. Again, I'll leave it there, and thank you again to the organisers for the invitation to join this panel.
Thank you so much, Professor Vialle, for sharing the experience of and practices of the University of Wollongong. I think the strategic vision that you shared is something that we can all learn from. I'm so glad that you brought up the issue of ethics and care, especially in thinking about university social responsibility. But you also very clearly connected the local to the global by speaking about ethical internationalization. And I think that's one of the challenges of thinking about the university's social responsibility. While many of us work at the local level, from a governance point of view, it is quite a challenge to connect these different scales from the local to the national to the global, because sometimes issues may clash as well. And perhaps in the next round of our discussion, we could talk more about that. But we'll first check if there are any questions that have come up on our live session. Let's just see if there are any questions here. Okay. So the mission of higher education institutions to contribute to social, economic, environmental, and cultural development of communities has long been a core function of universities alongside teaching and research. However, the service mission is often disconnected from the internationalization agenda, and services are predominantly oriented. How can universities take the global social responsibility to benefit the citizens of the world? So that's I think relates very directly to what Professor Vialle was talking about, but maybe somebody else, other panelists have something to say about this. How can universities take the global social responsibility to benefit the citizens of the world?
If I may just respond very briefly to this, it's because obviously recently we reviewed here as within the partnership teams the idea of internationalization. What does it mean to operate internationally and to have, for example, various partners? We don't tend to have campuses, but we tend to have partners, either delivering part of our degree or partners perhaps running their own programs. And one thing that came to my mind a few weeks ago when we attended a particular conference was this idea that, especially in the UK, you get a lot of international students coming to the UK, and it might seem quite, but actually barely 10%, if not less, of students actually travel for their studies. Most students study in their particular context, national context. So it was kind of interesting in a sense of sometimes we do feel a lot about this migration of movement of students, but actually we have been working with various partners around the world in terms of embedding the idea of transformational education in a very similar way that Dr. Vialle has mentioned, in terms of saying, okay, how do you ensure that this Essex degree or Essex qualification, how does it meet local expectations? Because one of the challenges of prior internationalization has been, if you want, the transfer of a syllabus from a country, let's say the UK, to a particular context. And what we are trying to develop further is collaboration, co-construction of particular syllabuses, so that it doesn't just reflect a particular degree and back in a country, whether it's the US, whether it's the UK, whether it's one of the major T&E providers. So that is not how to put it. It's not an easy process. It's not it's not something. It's not something that perhaps that is takes time, and trying to build together academic communities in those countries and academic communities here. It takes a few months minimum, I think, is to agree on these things. But I think that's the way forward. I think a lot of the next developments around internationalization would be that sort of bringing together the perspective of a local as well as the perspective of outside that particular context. Yeah, that's just a sort of reaction to your question.
I could add a quick word if I might. So if you think about the global and international levels, of course, we conflate these two ideas most of the time when we say global or international. When you look at them carefully, there is a difference, right? So the global commons are influenced by all of us, but the governance of the global commons are done by a range of multilateral institutions. And indeed, these institutions, we need to have university partnerships with these institutions and develop, programs that feed both ways. When I was the principal advisor on poverty and sustainable livelihoods at the United Nations Development Program in New York, I had the privilege, I had a global responsibility, and I recognized, the value of universities, the research they were doing, but they had little or no clue. They saw the UNDP as a behemoth, it's this big, impervious kind of organizations that believe they know everything on their own, and so on. So we need a two-way interaction where the global institutions, multilateral institutions recognize the value of universities and begin to take an active step towards engaging relevant research. On the other hand, university academic researchers tend to believe that their work is automatically of such high importance that it's of relevance to these institutions. And that might not be the case. They need to do what I used to call back in the day, post-normal science. So post-normal science is about defining the research problem so that it addresses concrete global goals, concrete global problems. So that's one set of issues we need to do. And I think that way we define an agenda that when we begin our institutional arrangements towards internationalizing either our campuses or not, it feeds into that broader agenda. And the second point is the international processes. So we have climate change and the COPs and the IPCCs and so on. And we have, species extinction and desertification, a whole range of international instruments, conventions, human rights, and so on. The role of universities, and Michael had started to talk about that, the role of universities in engaging in those processes need to be really, I guess, strengthened, activated, and a deliberate effort made to to help universities understand how to participate. I mean, I've seen so many academics get frustrated because they believe it is automatic that their ideas will be sort of absorbed or accepted by the international process. It doesn't work like this. We have to get some degree of training and then, massage both sides so that interaction is enhanced.
I can just add something on that thread. I think I had to do a series of interviews of NGOs and think tanks and stuff a couple of years ago under a fellowship in Washington. What I found is they were all kind of bewildered as to how I was focused on Asia, because that's sort of what I do. They was kind of bewildered as to how to reach out to the Asian communities that they want to support. On the one hand, if they provide funding, then they're accused of interfering in some way in local affairs and vilified. But on the other hand, how to have a voice there. And one of the things I think that came out of the discussion was, at least in East Asia, and I'd say in South Asia as well, the universities are actually held up in a high esteem. So if events around topics, critical issues in the society can be organized on campuses where international participants come in and speak, this often gets a lot of attention in the media and everything. It takes on legs of its own. So it's a very practical way. I don't know how this works across Europe, but in Asia, academics, their voices are heard if you can put it out there where somebody can consume it. So the academic you're talking about who thinks, well, what I'm saying ought to sell itself. Well, it doesn't. It needs to be presented to people in a venue where it can be seen. And I've found over the years, when we're trying to draw attention to an issue, if we put it in an academic conference and then we approach our partners outside and they don't throw money in the country, they're not invading the country, but they send professors over, they provide funding for professors to come and join in that conversation, then this gets heard across country boundaries and it really gets in the media, it gets reported. Because these are kind of major events sometimes in areas where universities are located where I've been working. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think, and I'm sorry I dropped out because of internet connectivity, talking about challenges of having this international conversation. But yes, I think I myself teach on this course that works with local communities in 4 neighboring villages of our university. And I think many of us involve the local community in our teaching. There are various ways in which we can bring the local community into our classroom. I think it was Professor Davis who had mentioned how our publication strategies are often, very Scopus focused, and many of the collaborative publications, so people who work alongside communities, and Professor Vialle mentioned the idea of ethics and care. And one important strategy has been to bring in communities into our publication, so co-published pieces. Many of those are, of course, again, not probably Scopus listed because they can take many different forms. But, again, moving on from the local to this idea of connecting the global, something that has really become important after the pandemic, if not critical, is something that we need to.
Bad. We're missing the punchline.
Jayani is not having a good day.
Yeah, and she's in the university building. We're in our home.
I am in the university, so I have an IT team.
Oh, you're in the wrong place, Jayani.
Yeah.
Yes, I am so sorry. But before the internet connection goes for me again.
And it's gone.
It's gone.
It beat you to it.
Yes. Could you hear me?
No.
Yes.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
I'll be brief. There is one more question that has come on our channel. What's the best way for universities to help students to contribute to make meaningful contribution to local communities that survives beyond their stay at universities? I think that might be the last question that we are able to respond, and I hope my connection stays on till then. So how can universities help students to contribute to make meaningful contribution to local communities that survives beyond their stay at universities? Professor Vialle.
One of the things that we do is we have an extracurricular program called UOWX, where all sorts of these kinds of activities can be undertaken. They can be part of coursework, but more frequently they're extra things where they become involved in the community and so on. And it's about reflecting on this, what they can contribute, how they work together, that kind of interaction. So it's a formal recognition that we value it, and that employers value that kind of interaction.
I would say another, oh, sorry.
Professor Davis, or
okay, yeah, another thing is, well, of course, the students aren't all social scientists or lawyers. Students like architecture or design and other things can do a lot of things. I recall my old alma mater, Yale, that students in architecture were organized over the summer to design a memorial for COVID. For the African-American community and how it impacted that. So they spent the whole summer going around interviewing people in the community and actually creating things that are hard and on the ground that could be used. Another case that people approached me after that and asked, a train station in I hate to say it, but it's Cambridge, was looking horrible. And the idea was that students could contribute to that. They could create art to go along on the walls and stuff. So, I mean, sometimes there's very practical things they can do. Sometimes when you do social things, your footprint isn't visible very much longer, but some things can remain around for a long time where community design and urbanization and so on problems are addressed. Yeah.
I think we have encouraged students to move away necessarily. I mean, the final year project was classic academic project, but now there's a choice to do it with an NGO. There's a choice to do it with an organization, and you're hopefully that this is not just a one-off just to get some, to get the credits, but also that they take that forward in terms of participating in civic life, because it is a challenge. The sort of employment income challenges that students may have, and how do they know, sometimes I think you can see they want to do things, but how do you? So I think we need to plant the seeds of these particular ideas in the way that we do our coursework, and we do our sort of assess our students, and in a way that this becomes transferable later on. So I think that's one of the main ways I think we could do that.
A few points. Okay, you're back.
yes, I am back. I am so sorry. Professor Singh, did you have to add?
2 or 3 points. One is, what can we as faculty do? And I think the first thing we do is inspiration. Let our students get inspired, understand, the nature of local communities, let them know opportunities and that reality. And like you were saying, Jayani, many of us get our students engaging with local communities. When they go out there, their eyes are opened. They develop a real kind of an understanding and what I might call empathy, even sympathy for the communities. And some of them get inspired to the point that they want to dedicate their future careers to a kind of engagement that is not typically academic. So the first thing is, what do we do? How do we inspire our students? And what do we teach in our course curricula so that they are exposed to that kind of opportunity and possibility? The second big point is, what do students do? So we encourage our students to self-organize, to form student-based organizations, like student-led policy research teams, student-led community engagement teams. And we have a range of these student-led bodies. They identify their priorities. We provide a faculty mentor to guide them, of course, because they are growing up and so on. And so they become engaged on their own. And of course, the question was, and to keep doing that after you leave university, right? So that when it is self-organized, some of them will hopefully keep going afterwards. What I find of real practical value is setting up centers. So we have our schools, or some universities have their departments and so on, faculties and so on. These practical-oriented research centers, and I direct 2 of them, these centers, we have lots of volunteer student researchers who help us define the research topics, and they engage in that research. We work with them to co-produce publications, and it might not be Scopus Index, but it goes out in a journal somewhere or something that Michael will appreciate. And but I don't think our HR department might. Nevertheless, nevertheless, they get recognition. And that is important to them. When we write their recommendations, they get recognition. And they are able, and here is the link, when they leave the university, they can still be members of that center and continue that work. So those are 3 practical ways. I'll give you one example. One student from the law school took a course I teach on legal empowerment of the poor. She went off to do her LLM at King's College London, came back, and then she called me and said, look, I'm being headhunted by all these corporate giants who want to pay me 1.x lakh of rupees, but that's not my goal. I really was inspired by that course, and I want to set up an NGO to work with poor communities to see how the law can help them. So I said, all right, let's get something going, working with the center to continue your interest. And so I can see it happening. And these are some concrete ways of making that happen. And we should open up the ideas to all our students.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for providing those practical ideas of implementing this idea of social responsibility at the university. I think 1 hour was too short to do justice to this very important idea. But I think all of you have left us with food for thought. I take back personally, this idea of ethical nationalization, bringing in marginalized communities into the university, a focus on global commons, but also thinking about, how university governance can address issues that very often play out at a key local level. As a geographer, I'm very keen to understand this connection and interaction between different scales, between the local, national, and the global. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and for participating in this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.